Hello, hi. How are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Got a good show for you today. We're going to be talking about something that really dovetails nicely with the big three on podcast by George. We talk about climate, number one, and we're going to be talking about weather and maybe a little bit of climate today. But we're going to be talking with our good friend from Iowa State University, Dr. William A. Gallus Jr. I like that. I like to mention that myself once in a while because I'm George A. Clark Jr. He's a professor of meteorology. He's been at Iowa State University for over 25 years. His research interests include improved understanding of the prediction of thunderstorm systems, their evolution, rainfall, severe weather, including derechos, folks, as well as prediction of winds for wind energy. And he also looks at how climate change is impacting extreme weather events. So let's click a button here and there's his live line. I should have brought that up. Doggone it, I like to do that when I'm talking about people so that they can get a good look at my live line graphic there. We didn't get that on screen. I forgot to put it up there. But let's bring him in and say good morning to Dr. Gallus.
Morning, George.
I tell people that it's weird and getting weirder. And the derecho always struck me as an odd weather event. It's not unheard of. It is rather uncommon, but we're entering into a situation with the drought that is very severe and it's very significant. And what I like to do on my podcast, Doc, is cover things that people are overlooking and ignoring a little bit. And so I'm happy to be able to go through that with you today. We've got some video and some interesting graphics. We're going to be talking about that. Climate will be a part of it, but I'm going to bring this up on screen right here. Okay, so tell me what you a day that will live in infamy in the meteorological terms. Tell me what you see when you look at that graph.
This is one of the reasons why it was rather hard to predict the derecho very far in advance. We typically teach our students that when you have a cold front coming into Iowa, which is that blue line on your map, it often triggers storms out ahead of it, okay, off to the south and east. But as some of us were waking up that morning at 7 a.m., the only storms were back behind the cold front. And when you see that, that means typically they're not feeding off of the really warm, humid air down low. They're actually sort of suspended aloft, which can make it harder to have severe weather impacts like strong winds. But the problem was that cold front was not moving very fast, and the thunderstorms were able to move fast enough to catch up to it and get into the side of the front that was full of that really sultry air that morning of August 10th. And that led to huge problems for Iowa.
Okay, so just this time 2 years ago, it's August 11th when we're doing this live stream. But what else do you see here that's significant? I look at this and I see, I don't know if that's a trailing warm front or what that is running down there through Illinois. Is that significant as far as what was happening?
That again is just showing much of southern and central Iowa was sort of on the backside of that warm front. And so we were in air that was really steamy that morning. I know as I saw the storms rolling across western Iowa, I was looking around in my backyard probably about 10 in the morning, an hour before it hit. And I remember by the time I came into the house, I was surprised how uncomfortable it had felt outside for being only 10 in the morning.
Wow. So here we are, we're beginning. This is the start of it. It's just entering up there in northwest Iowa at 7 o'clock in the morning. And I've got this. We're talking northwest Iowa here, folks. This is Lamar's, Iowa. And this is a shot. It's a beautiful, if you can call it derecho, and the hideous damage that that we saw inflicted, if you can call this beautiful at all. What do you see when you look at this, Doc?
What's really interesting about this picture is I'm surprised they were able to get such a beautiful view of the derecho. Those clouds that look kind of like flying saucers, we refer to those as shelf clouds. And so if you have a thunderstorm that typically has some pretty strong winds with it and a big blob of cold air that it's created underneath it, as that cold air is spreading out, it's lifting the warm, humid air up in a sort of a nice, gentle fashion, which creates these very smooth, almost circular looking clouds. Many of us in Iowa, the main thing we remember about the derecho is we did not get to see this. I was outside watching it roll in, thinking for sure this would have a spectacular shelf cloud because it was obvious there was such strong winds already occurring. And instead in much of Iowa, I would say it looked like garbage. Basically, the sky was gray and just got grayer and grayer. and you didn't really see many features. So I'm assuming, early in its lifetime, when it would have been near Northwest Iowa, they were lucky enough that they could actually get a view of some interesting clouds, at least, before all heck broke loose shortly after.
Ah, well, so okay, when you see a skyscape like this, or if we see a skyscape like this again, I mean, do you see trouble here? I mean, is this going to be a bad situation with the derecho? Is there a possibility that this could still turn into nothing when you see this?
Right. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to have any damage. The main thing it probably would alert you to is the winds are going to at least get gusty. Probably at least have some 30 to 40-mile-an-hour winds. But if I was out camping, for instance, and had no cell service, no way to know what was going on, I would at least be aware that there could be some severe intensity winds. I would never expect what happened on the day of the derecho, though.
Okay, so this is Northwest Iowa. This is like 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. There it is. There's a little video. I mean, Mike, if you see that, folks, that that shelf cloud. I was at a radio station one time. Doc had a reporter out on the street that ran in the studio after seeing something like that at the station. I literally ran in, grabbed the microphone, and hyperventilated right on the air. Scared the bejabbers out of
Well,
everybody. I'm going to tell that story someday, but we're
well,
not going
those
to get.
the shelf clouds are so low to the ground
Yeah.
that the motions in them you can see it really easily because it's not that far away from your head. And oftentimes there's a lot of rolling motion. And so I know one time here in the city of Ames, they actually blew the sirens. There was no tornado warning. And there really wasn't the kind of rotation that would lead to a tornado. But I think people were terrified and calling in because they could see so much rapid motion going on in the shelf cloud.
Yeah, that's the way this thing was. It looked like the roller head on a combine coming right at us. It was a warthog from hell. I mean, it scared this guy. I'm telling you. And then everybody that was listening at the station. My God, he's hyperventilating. Okay, so this is up in Northwest Iowa. All right, now this is. I like to show this because this is the drama, and this is the good news, and maybe even sometimes the bad news. With Doppler. But I mean, you want drama, you want color. I mean, this is Technicolor. We're talking Walt Disney weather here, Doc.
Yes. In fact, what's really interesting about this picture, with yesterday being the 2nd-year anniversary, many people were posting on social media. And it was surprising how many people from Illinois, which is where the storms are in your picture, people from Illinois were saying it was so well predicted. We had all day to sit there and worry whether or not we would have a house by the end of the day. Well, talk to any of us in central Iowa. That is not what our memory is. Our memory is that came out of nowhere. I mean, unless you were paying attention that morning, there were good warnings issued like an hour or two beforehand. But most of us woke up that day expecting a sunny day. So, yeah, your picture is interesting. We in Iowa really took it on the chin since it formed here and became strong here. But if you were in Illinois, you were able to hear the reports coming in from Iowa and see that thing coming towards you. I would guess that would be the Midwesterners' equivalent of a hurricane, where you can watch it days ahead of time, approaching you. And I would guess there's sort of this sense of dread. Okay, is it going to hit me? What's it going to really be like?
Well, as I said on the show that we did last year, maybe a couple of years ago, when the derecho had just come through, my weather radio went off. I was aware of it. I was thinking thunderstorm. I mean, this is a lot different than a thunderstorm. Let me set this in motion here and give this a look. And again, you can comment. Let's see.
Right. And one of the things that was interesting when you started your loop, you actually saw the yellow outlines of severe thunderstorm warnings. The National Weather Service is trying to issue these warnings that are typically pretty small, that might include a piece of one county and maybe another one. On that day, there were so many reports of damage and strong winds coming in that they just had to issue these broad warnings that covered big chunks of Iowa, and it was moving at about 60 miles an hour. So I know in the Cedar Rapids area, people talked about the sun was out, and if you went away for 30 minutes and then looked outside, it was like, am I dreaming? Now it looks like we're all going to die. And 30 minutes ago, it was sunny. So.
It was like a science fiction movie. I want to play this loop again. I want to look at this. So Again, there's no better weather observer than you. I mean, honest to God, 25 years in the classroom up there teaching that. Tell me what stands out to you the most about this. Is it the size of this line? Is it the bow? Is it the speed of its movement?
I would
Or
say
is it
this.
the fact that it doesn't seem to weaken at all as it goes along? Here goes. Watch this now.
So when it's near I-35, it's pretty much a straight line. So it's kind of surprising we were having as strong of winds that we did. But yeah, right about here, the amount of bowing and how fast it was moving, and that it was staying alive a long time. All three of those things that you said, George, were very noteworthy about this particular thunderstorm complex.
Before we move off of the Derecho, a couple of things. When we first talked about this, you said, and I'll never forget this, derechos are identified after the fact. They're not before then. Do they get named? I can't remember that or not. Like a hurricane? Has this derecho got a name?
Not officially.
Okay.
There may be private weather companies. I don't know if the Weather Channel has resorted to naming thunderstorm systems now. But there's nothing really in the books where the federal government through the National Weather Service intends to name these.
Okay. That's interesting. And the other thing that we had talked about, I had never and I had followed the weather. Yeah, I used to be in the news business. You're interested in weather. If you're in the news business, you ought to be anyway. I used to be a salesperson flying around the country. If you're flying around the country, you should be interested in the weather. I'm a sports fan. I mean, sports guys, you got to be watching the weather because, I mean, again, you're moving around the country. It affects wherever you're at. Farmers, I grew up on a farm. You got to be interested in the weather. So I followed this very closely my entire life. I was not aware of the term derecho. I had never heard this before, but you said on the show that although uncommon, they're not unheard of. And we've already had one since then, right? At least one. How? Yeah.
Two really that affected
Okay.
parts of Iowa. The one was the extremely unusual one that took place in December. I think you had me on your show that
Yeah.
morning to talk about the Kentucky tornadoes. And instead, I think a lot of our conversation was on how bizarre the weather was going to be on December 15th in Iowa. So that ended up being a derecho. Most everybody in Iowa was hit with winds at least 60 miles an hour as those unusual storms came through. I have video filming down my street with the tornado sirens blowing and all the Christmas lights sparkling, which just doesn't
Yeah.
make sense. And then we had one this spring that mostly stayed west of Iowa, but it clipped the northwest corner of the state. And that again was a derecho.
I got one more film clip. Again, I want you to look at this and see. I love your commentary on. Tell us what you see with this perspective. This is a little bit different too. Let's see this.
So this is, a satellite image. The white stuff is the clouds, but they've actually overlaid lightning data. So again, I think the main thing standing out here was just how big the system was. And I saw this, George sent this to me this morning, and it was interesting to me that it did have a lot of lightning when it got into eastern Iowa and in Illinois. Here in Ames, I remember one of the unusual things was I wasn't hearing much thunder or seeing much lightning, but some of the thunder might have been hidden by the roar of the wind that lasted, a rather long time.
All right, so that's Derecho 2020, mostly unnamed, I guess, but not forgotten. And there have been derechos since then. It's one of those things. I think there's probably going to be more of them. I think it's because of the climate. We can talk about that a little bit as we go along. How about your teaching now in the classrooms? This is a bellwether landmark event in weather. Is this a part of what you're teaching now at Iowa State?
Yes, I actually really expanded the amount that I teach on derechos. I think when you're a professor, if you want your students to have a good experience and to find the class interesting, you always try to work in something that's fresh in their memories. And so after knowing that pretty much everybody would have gone through that event, I talk a lot more about the wind and thunderstorms and what you look for derechos. And then this is a case. I show the weather maps from that case as a good example. Partly because it wasn't super obvious from the weather setup that we should have had a very high-end derecho that day.
Well, folks, we're talking with Dr. William Gallus, Dr. Bill Gallus. Dr. Bill at Iowa State University. He's been up there over 25 years teaching meteorology and weather. And these are unprecedented weather events. We've got another one, maybe not completely unprecedented, but it's very significant and it needs to have more attention than it's getting, and it's drought. But before we talk about the drought, Doc, anything else on derecho that you want to mention or include here before we move along?
Two things. Just so that the Iowa derecho was sort of a wake up call for the whole country. Those of us in Iowa really experienced it firsthand. So it started some conversations going on where I think the Weather Service is investigating the possibility of issuing maybe a different kind of severe thunderstorm warning when the storm is going to be truly something like the derecho. Right now, there's sort of this one size fits all severe thunderstorm warning. And then the other thing is we realize that there is no set definition of a derecho. It's defined after the fact, and it's somehow related to many people over a large area having strong winds from the storm. So I know there are some efforts now to try to come up with a concrete definition that everybody uses. So I think the Iowa derecho, one good thing that came out of it is it really put the idea of a derecho into the forefront of people's minds, and so that we are looking at things that we can do differently that may help in warning people down the road.
So, from a preparedness standpoint or a reaction standpoint, again, I mentioned the fact that I, heard it on my, excuse me, on my weather radio. What should people do any differently? Now, to me, a thunderstorm warning, a tornado warning, and maybe a derecho warning, if there is such a thing, or if there is going to be such a thing, you probably ought to respond the same way in all instances. With a derecho, should you be prepared for longer duration or more severity, or how would you quantify or describe the three?
Right. If there's a severe thunderstorm warning, I think right now the main way they can try to convey that it's going to be a very powerful event like the derecho is if you listen closely, they'll often give a value of the winds. So the default for a severe thunderstorm warning might be this storm has 60-mile-an-hour winds. But if you hear them mention 80-mile-per-hour winds or 100, that's a good clue that you're going to expect a lot more damage than normal. And if it's a derecho, right, the winds are going to last a lot longer. So that's also going to really create a lot more damage. And I have a son who works at a body shop, and I know in Cedar Rapids area, I think they were backed up for like 2 years for car repairs. So I'm thinking one thing that people may have been able to do a lot differently to avoid a lot of damage if they realize we're talking like an hour of horrendous wind is to move their cars. If you don't have at least into the garage would be the ideal, but if not a garage, like move them away from trees. So that to me seems like that might have been a rather preventable huge chunk of damage that, if we really had known how intense the derecho was going to be, people could have taken that action.
I love body shop guys. I tell people all the time, you want to know what an artist is? Those guys are artists. So what they do is amazing. It's good to talk about the car damage. I'm also glad that you mentioned the trees in Cedar Rapids and the tree damage because of this derecho in 2020. It's unbelievable. It's massive. I mean, it's off the chart, and that's oftentimes overlooked. People don't think about the damage to the flora and the fauna because of these types of things. We always think about our property.
Right. I mean, I know my biggest worry when it was rolling through Ames, and I had some videos where my son was shooting some video. Is you hear me talking about the trees? It was like, oh, please, please don't let the trees go down. Please, I didn't want to lose my trees because I planted them 25 years ago, and they now are big and beautiful. But I've often thought about that when you see towns like Greensburg, Kansas, that have been hit by tornadoes. The people there often say one of the hardest things for them to deal with afterwards is it's not the same place that they loved living in before. It's totally you lose the tree canopy, and that's usually a huge selling point for really thinking the area that you live in is beautiful.
That's very similar to the the Fujiyama scale, the F4s, EF4s, EF5s, and that type of thing. You see, I mean, they rebuild the town, for instance, but you can see that tree damage forever. I'm reminded of Manson, Iowa, was that way a long time. I mean, where's the mature trees in this town? This is an old town. Where are the well, they got wiped off with one of those EF4 or EF5 tornadoes. Okay, let's move along here because we only have the doc for a certain amount of time. I want to bring up this next chart here. Now we're talking about drought and we're talking about rainfall. And I've done some circling here. This is a drought rainfall map, and up in the northwest corner here, the top left, you're seeing Sioux City. This is oftentimes referred to as the most drought-stricken, problematic place in the state. But this is changing, and it's not changing for the better. It's getting worse in many areas. And I've circled Des Moines and places to the south and southeast. Now, just compare this to where the dock is at Iowa State University. See how it's yellow? See how it's green? I mean, there are parts in Ames maybe that have normal precipitation. And then we look up in the top right here in the northeast corner of the state, Decorah. I don't know, Doc, does that blue mean that they have above normal precipitation, or is that normal, or what is that?
It's well above. So on this map, the colors are the actual amount of rain in inches since May 1st. So I had the Iowa Environmental Mesonet create this map, and thinking that, May 1st, I should say. So May 1st is when things are really growing. So yeah, the brown colors you're seeing are generally places that have only had maybe 8 inches of rain or less since May 1st. Normally, most of Iowa would have had about 14 inches, which is what that light green color corresponds to. The blue near Decorah is 24 inches. So believe it or not, there are parts of Iowa that have had almost twice the normal amount of rain since May 1st.
And this feast or famine, this drought or flood situation that we have, I want you to comment also whether or not this can be correlated to climate change, or if this is just the way it is. The other thing I want to point out here, one of the reasons that I put these circles on the map, you have these gradients of colors. Look in these brown areas now. This is in the drought-stricken areas that the doc was talking about. But you see this dark brown, you see a lighter gradient of brown or tan or whatever that is, and then you see these little pockets. Sometimes they're no more than specks, these white areas, and it shows you how isolated this extreme drought can be. When you see that lightest of gradient there, that white, those places are desert dry.
Right. In those cases, you're getting down to, places may have only had about 4 or 5 inches since May 1st. And there was a recent feature on a website that the Iowa Mesonet publishes, updates daily, near Sioux City, in one of those white areas. This year is now running as, I think, the driest year in history in over 100 years of records.
Wow.
So I would assume likewise down near Ottumwa in that little pocket of white, likewise, it's probably going to be maybe the driest year people can remember.
Yeah, and that's the point that I was trying to make. It's as bad as a lot of people can remember, myself included. I'm in one of these little white specks, I think, because this is the worst drought that I can recall. I haven't been around forever, but I've been around for a while, folks. Now, this is something the doc is familiar with. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor. I think this is out of Nebraska University out there. And this, at first glance, doesn't appear very significant, but this is a weekly change. And I wanted to show this because on the left is updated, and on the right is what it was just the week before. Well, look at that tan coloration there and its expansion across the state. And this is from a week ago, I think, a week or two ago. It's gotten worse since then.
Yeah. In fact, they just updated it this morning.
Okay.
And the two biggest changes is the tan area in southern Iowa has now become orange. So that's becoming a more severe drought. And that little strip of white that kind of includes Ames, that's sort of running between the main areas of color, has basically filled in now to yellow, that it's becoming abnormally dry, even here in Ames, where, like you showed, for the year, or since May 1st, we had been doing pretty good, but we haven't had very much rain in the last couple of weeks here.
Well, I wish I'd have grabbed the most recent slide, but people can visualize that. One thing about these colors now in the drought, and it's kind of like the difference between a derecho, a tornado, severe thunderstorm. Even they're exciting. The alerts go off. You see Doppler particularly that, looks like a car wreck on a weather map. The drought is kind of passive. It changed slowly. It's the nature of it. But even the colors here are kind of blasé. But this, to someone like Dr. Gallus, this is really important and not frightening, perhaps, but it's a little shocking.
Right. And anytime you're having almost a category, so a color shade change per week, they refer to that as a flash drought.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, we're starting to have that show up in Iowa. It really affected Texas and Oklahoma in the last month or so. where there have been places I think that changed by 4 categories in just like 4 or 5 weeks.
I think I have. Let me see if I can bring this up. This is from the National Drought Mitigation Center. Okay, this it's not a real good look. It's very small, and I apologize for that for people that are watching. But this is the flash drought situation that the doc is talking about. How bad is it? A flash drought showing up with 4 category changes over 4 weeks on the current U.S. drought monitor. So if you have one, that's enough to be concerned. But this thing is, like I said at the onset, bad, and it's getting worse very quickly. Look at the bullseye here that he's talking about down there in Oklahoma.
And one thing that helped them to go, so quickly into absolutely extreme drought is they've had temperatures running 100 degrees or higher, every day for weeks and weeks. Here in Iowa, the one thing that is helping us and that may continue to help us in the next 2 weeks is we generally haven't been having, week-long spells of 100-degree temperatures. And we've actually been maintaining a good bit of humidity through the hot days that we have had. So we are changing. Sadly, we're going in the wrong direction in much of the state toward worse drought. But we can be thankful that we're not having a heat wave at the same time. So that is kind of slowing how rapidly we're going into more extreme drought.
And it may not be that exciting, but there are people watching it. Let's bring this up on screen. Now, this is another source. This is drought.gov. And this is the key points that they're identifying. Drought has rapidly intensified throughout the summer in portions of the Midwest. This is this flash drought that Dr. Gallus is talking about. Currently, 17% of the Midwest is in drought, which is 16% more than 5 weeks ago. Again, I'm running behind here a little bit. So this was a week or two. It's only gotten worse. The highest drought level in the region is extreme drought, D3, which is currently impacting northwest Iowa and southern Missouri. Current drought impacts include widespread vegetation stress, grass, plants, trees, crops, specifically in corn, where the hot and dry conditions have coincided with the reproductive phase, which will likely have a negative impact on yield. Wanted to bring this up because I wanted to opine here a little bit. I had this on my podcast just recently. When I travel around the country, when I used to travel more than I did, I would run into people that were knowledgeable about Iowa, maybe even from Iowa. And they were smart enough that they would always start their conversation with me. How's the corn doing? Because that, as the corn goes, so goes Iowa. And that tells you a lot, tells you about the weather, tells you about the economy. It used to tell you about the amount of work, all those types of things. But when it comes to this drought situation, what I'm telling people is because of the hybridization, because of the change in corn itself, you can ride a bicycle across Iowa on ragbri and see these cornfields as you go by. They look normal. They look all right. In some instances, they may even be normal, and unless you, shuck an ear and take a look at the kernels and how big the ear is and that type of thing, you probably can't see it. But the point that I make to people, Doc, is that when I was a kid, which again was a while ago, the drought that we're currently experiencing, it would have resulted in corn only being 4 foot tall and maybe collapsing on itself. It's the same drought. It's just different corn.
Right. 2012, which most of us remember was only 10 years ago, I think was the worst drought in Iowa since certainly 1988. And I believe that was became the hottest summer in U.S. history. It was the first time we were able to beat the 1936 Dust Bowl year. And we expected to have, really horrible corn yields. And we're kind of surprised in the end that things weren't hurt as badly as we expected. And, you hit the nail on the head. It's because the way we've bred corn now, the roots go down extremely far and are able to tap in water that may be there from having a wet year, last year or 2 years ago. What's kind of bad in those parts of Iowa now that are having a really dry summer is we've had in much of Iowa 2 previous summers in a row that were dry. You kind of joked about here in Ames, we were in this little tiny zone that's been lucky this summer, but I'm pretty sure the last 2 summers, we were the ones that were always being missed out. So we had extremely dry summers the past 2. So, that makes it a little harder to tell what will the corn yields be this year. Is there still sufficient water deep down that the corn is able to tap into it?
Now, let me bring this up on screen because this is exactly what you're talking about. This is from the U.S. Drought Monitor. They only keep track from 2000 to the present. And I got to bring this up a little bigger here, but this is what we're looking at. And this arrow that I have, this is 2012. This is what you're talking about, this severe drought, which right now is probably worse than the drought that we're experiencing currently, correct?
Right. Certainly, from the standpoint, a bigger chunk of the state was being affected by hotter temperatures and extremely dry conditions. Like you mentioned, if you're in some of those areas south of Des Moines, toward Ottumwa, or up near Sioux City, the drought this summer might be worse. But it's just as you showed on that map, this summer it seems to be more small scale pockets that are really suffering. In 2012, it was a bigger chunk of the state.
I don't want to give people the wrong idea either. If you look at this again, the key to this is from 2000 to the present. I think if you saw a graph like this or a chart like this from 1950 to 2000, for instance, or 1960 to 2000, I don't think that you would see this high of spikes, this much orange and red, this much of a drought. I think that this is a phenomenon that is more current, that has occurred since the turn of the century. And again, my opinion, this is part of a trend, part of climate change. Do you think that way, Doc, or is this just
Um,
weather that we're looking at?
You know, it's a tough question. I mean, if you look at what is happening with climate change, the number one thing that obviously has been going on is things are getting warmer. And the warmer it gets, the faster you tend to evaporate the water out of the soil. So even if you were keeping the same amount of rain falling, you're going to have more issues with the soil getting dry because it is warmer. So we do know eventually for sure there will be more droughts happening. Iowa's been a very tricky place to try to pinpoint that. And in fact, in Iowa, our rainfall has generally been going up. Uh, the trend is upward with global warming. Um, but I know to our west and south, especially, I think drought is obviously happening more often there and it's already showing up. Here in Iowa, those improved corn hybrids and the ability of corn to reach down really deep into the earth and grab the water and then release it into the atmosphere has been helping us in some ways. It's also been keeping us from really warming up. Our summers don't show much of a trend in temperature yet. Most of the rest of the country, it's very obviously warming up. But we do believe that we can't keep changing our corn to keep saving us from the effects of global warming that are showing up elsewhere in the country. There's going to be a tipping point at some point where it will be too dry, and we'll have a drought where the corn really will suffer, like you said, and only be 4 feet tall. And who knows? Then we might start to experience this feedback where it will really heat up in the summer.
Well, in the meantime, don't be an old gummer like me and evaluate everything on how the corn looks. I mean, because it's bad, folks. And I want to bring this up on screen because this was interesting to me. Again, like the derecho, I'd never heard of derecho till we had one. Well, this flash drought thing that Dr. Gallus talks about, I never heard of a flash drought. Flash flood, yeah. But flash drought, accelerated by extreme heat in eastern Oklahoma and adjacent states, appeared on the U.S. Drought Monitor with a 1 category per week degradation for the last 4 weeks in a row. That's what we talked about earlier. Drought is known as a creeping phenomenon, typically coming on over weeks or months. So again, it kind of sneaks up on you. And they're drier than normal compared with 30 years or more of weather data. But intense heat contributes to fast emerging drought, particularly at key points in the growing season. That's exactly what we're seeing now. Standard operating procedure for U.S. Drought Monitor authors limits changes to 1 category per week. We almost never change the map by more than 1 category per week. And even seeing it get worse by 1 category a week for 4 weeks in a row is unusual. That's from Brian Fuchs, one of the USDM authors and head of the National Drought Mitigation Center's monitoring program area. Plus, this was an unusually large area. Now, while the USDM does change by more than 1 category in a week, it's more often the direction of improvement. Multi-category changes happen most frequently when a hurricane or a tropical storm, maybe even a derecho, brings heavy rains or flooding to a drought-stricken area. I mean, that is the good news about a drought and the weather as opposed to climate. I mean, you can have some rain and get yourself out of a drought immediately. In comparison, multi-category degradations over short periods, like what's happening in Oklahoma and elsewhere right now, are less common. Okay, since the early 2000s, drought researchers have referred to fast emerging drought driven by heat as flash drought. Although it does not have a precise definition, Fuchs said a 2 or 3 class change in 4 weeks could also be a flash drought. Okay, Doc, well, if that's true, I mean, this is a flash drought because of what you said earlier. I mean, that 4 category change.
Right. And, back to your question. So flash droughts, it'd be very consistent. Probably if you analyze them, I'm sure flash droughts are increasing in frequency because of the fact that the planet is warming. Since a key ingredient to get a flash drought is it has to get very hot to help the effect of not getting the rain that you need, rapidly lead to problems with the soil drying out.
Okay, great. Let me come back in here because before we leave, I wanted to play this one thing that I thought was great. I love this soupy looking video here. This thing, Doc's he's a symphony fan. I wanted to play Ride of the Valkyries with this, but I couldn't get the music in it. I mean, it's what a stupendous looking thing this is. What were the tops on that derecho? Do you know? Is that up in the 50,000 foot range, or how high? Was that like a severe thunderstorm?
Right. It would have been, like a fairly typical severe thunderstorm. I actually have not heard people talk much about the tops, so I don't think they were as ridiculous as you sometimes hear where they're much above 60,000, but I'm sure they would have been above 50,000.
Okay, great. I wanted to also bring this in. Now, this is something new to me that I thought was very interesting. And you can't be a meteorologist, you can't be a weather guy if you're not interested in history. And anytime you get together with an old person that has ancestors, really, is what we're talking about, that lived through 1936 in Iowa, you don't know what bad is, folks. I mean, this is really bad. I'm going to read this. This is from the People's Weather Map. You can find them at peoplesweathermap.org on the web. It reads, the drought of 1936 affected many states throughout the Midwest. Deaths and damage were reported in as many as 10 states. As of July 16th, 1936, 3,848 deaths were reported in those 10 states. Now, Polk County here in Iowa was known for its larger cities, including the capital of Iowa. But in fact, there are many rural farm towns dispersed throughout the county, still is. The farmers in this county, just like other counties in Iowa, were severely affected by the drought. One word to describe the drought of 1936 is hot, very hot. The heat scorched crops and cracked the earth. Irma J. Long remembered people sleeping outside. Maybe you've seen those photos of people sleeping out at the, some of them slept outside at the county courthouses and stuff. I don't know exactly why they went out in public. Maybe because they couldn't sleep, or maybe they were in the city, or they thought it was cool. I don't know exactly why, but I've seen photos outside county courthouses, people sleeping outside because their homes would not cool off in the evening. So they captured that heat during the day, not much breeze, and you just couldn't stay inside. Morris Stamps recalled sleeping in his yard close to the house or sleeping on his porch to escape the heat. One individual said in July 9th, 1936, the earth is dry and hard and many cracks are appearing in the stubble field. I tied a string on the handle of a 12-inch crescent wrench and lowered it down a crack. I will not mention the distance. Some things are better left unsaid, even after a drought. I mean, I just love that. And I got to bring this up on the screen here, Doc. I happen to have one of these bad boys. This is the 12-inch. This is the crescent wrench that he was talking about. That's what he lowered into a crack in the earth. Now, a big difference back then was the corn, the tillage practices, and also the use of insecticides, because one thing that they had to contend with that we don't anymore, and we did even when I was a kid, grasshoppers. I mean, like locusts. I mean, a plague when you get this kind of a drought. You don't see much of that anymore.
Yeah, I don't know what the reason is for that, at least around this part.
Insecticides. I mean, they spray I mean, they treat it. It's got to be that, because when I was a kid, if you had a drought, even like the one that we're having, they would be everywhere. They love drought. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go back to see what else I've got in this article here, because this is great history. I love this thing. Let me bring this up on screen again. Animals suffered from this tremendous heat. Yeah, we overlooked that a lot. Animals that worked on the farm saw shortened work days and lifespans. Rose Stoops, who gave an oral history to Iowa Public Television in 1979, stated, "I had my hens walk from the house to the water pump, and they died on the way." My God. The heat wasn't the only problem Iowans faced in the summer of 1936. Along with the hot and dry conditions came enormous numbers of, grasshoppers and cinch bugs. I don't know what cinch bugs are, but I know what grasshoppers are. The grasshoppers and cinch bugs thrived in that condition, eating any crops still standing. A local reported grasshoppers clearing out a 20-acre oat field in just one day. Along with the heat and bugs was yet another destructive force. Hail fell in August. My God, can you imagine what these people had to deal with in 1936? It destroyed what, if anything, had been left of crops planted that year. Even with hail falling, rain didn't come until September. Kind of want to emphasize or underline that because we could be looking at a few weeks. I hope we're not looking at a few months before we get out of what we're involved in. It's the long range forecast that I've seen, Doc. I know you look at it all the time. I don't see any rain in the near future. Do you?
No, later today, if you're east of I-35, there might be some rain. It probably won't be a huge amount, especially from, say, Mason City down toward Waterloo and Cedar Rapids. The official forecast, is for August to end up drier than normal and actually for the fall to end up drier than normal. So it's not real encouraging when you look at these long range forecasts.
Well, like I said, if you're involved in any of those professions, if you're a farmer, if you've got a well, this is of concern. It's if you're these rivers and streams are drying up. There's poisons and toxins in these waterways that are becoming more prevalent, more difficult to purify. This is a bad deal for everybody all the way around. And talking about 1936, well, I wanted to ask you, do you know what were they dealing with back then? Was that the beginning of climate change? I don't see many people connect that dot, but was it an El Nino or a weather pattern or something? Or do you have any idea just why or what happened in 1936?
I think our best understanding is it was, and I honestly don't know if there was an El Nino or a La Nina, but the patterns, there's these patterns that sometimes take 10 or 20 years where the Pacific Ocean gets colder than normal off the West Coast or warmer. And depending what the pattern is, it makes it easier for it to be dry in the plains. So there were several years in the early 30s into the mid 1930s that ended up being very dry years. The problem was this was a time where agricultural practices were terrible compared to what we do now. To our west, for instance, people had settled in the western high plains in areas that are too dry to really grow many kinds of crops. They removed the normal prairie grasses that were growing, and they were doing fine in the 1920s because there were a bunch of wet years. And the 30s came and you had all these dry years happen. The crops failed and there was nothing to protect the soil. And so it's normally pretty windy out there. So you had loss of soil, the dust storms out there. So here in Iowa, why 1936 was so bad is by 1936, much of the area to our west was really like a massive desert now. And so just like Arizona and Nevada gets super hot because the ground is pretty much bare, that's what we had happening not far away from Iowa. And so the air could really heat up there. And it was pretty easy for that to roll into Iowa because our soil likewise was extremely dry.
I want to give Doc a break here and myself too. I'm going to play this video and it's about desertification. I want you to comment on that, but this is a pretty good little primer. It's only a couple of minutes here. Let me play this and we'll come right back.
Desertification is one of the biggest environmental challenges facing the planet. A process by which fertile land in dry regions becomes desert due to changes in the climate and human activities. According to the United Nations, over 24 billion tons of fertile soils disappear every year. 2/3 of the Earth is today in the process of becoming desert. If we don't do anything by 2050, 1.5 million square kilometers of agricultural land will be lost, an area equivalent to Peru and Ecuador combined. indiscriminate logging, exhaustion of land by intensive farming, and overgrazing are the main causes of desertification. Extreme weather phenomena, especially drought, also reduce arable land to desert land that is of vital importance in feeding the population. This is why desertification is such a lethal phenomenon for the planet. It is contributing to the disappearance of plant and animal species, causing poverty, conflict, and the migration of millions of people across borders. It also affects the climate through the formation of hurricanes, flooding, and water pollution. But the good news is that governments have promised to fight desertification from now until 2030. Measures such as reforestation and the natural fertilization of the land to reduce evaporation, responsible planning of grazing, rotation of crops, and protection of soils from wind erosion can halt desertification and return the planet to good health.
Okay, so the question for the doc is, I'm just looking at that, like our viewers, desertification. That sounds a little bit different than the Dust Bowl or than 1936. This is a long-term problem. There are mitigation strategies for this. Whether or not we're going to adhere to what we promised, like it was in there, is another thing. But let's say this drought continues, Doc. Let's say that it doesn't abate this year. Let's say that it continues into next year. Can this desertification that was identified in that video, could that happen here? Or is that, a third world country thing?
It depends on the choices we make and also how long it takes. As you alluded to, it usually takes, I would say at least a decade or two. But I would say what happened in the 30s was fits really well within the idea of desertification. It was a very rapid desertification. And you're a history buff. You might remember this more than I am, but I believe at the time there was a Secretary of Agriculture that FDR appointed who was from Iowa. I don't remember if it was
Wallace. Yeah.
Okay. He was the one who had the right idea of what needed to happen to stop the desertification. And luckily, people eventually listened to him. So, right now we have a lot going for us in Iowa. We would need many years in a row of drought. And I would think we would respond accordingly and not let our soil just sit there uncovered, which would help the process of desertification. When I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, this was a big problem in the Sahel, in that part of Africa, just south of the Sahara Desert. And the desert sort of expanded to the south. And I think they've been able to sort of stop that, or at least they were helped by sort of a change in the climate, where that area became more humid again with more precipitation. So, the desertification, the good thing about it is it seems if we're smart, we can reclaim some of the land, but you really don't want to have that happen in the first place. So it's really good to be monitoring what's going on and listen to best practices. I would assume if we have 4 years in a row of drought in Iowa, you'll hear people, agricultural experts telling you what are the best things to be doing at that stage, which might help prevent this from becoming a desert in this part of the country.
Well, I want to have everybody follow along at these sources that I recommended, particularly about the drought, because again, this has a tendency just to slip by people. This has been updated. This drought map is getting even worse. Let's say, Doc, and we're running out of time here, but let's say that these places that are in orange, or now where this tan is, that are now in orange, that are extremely drought stricken. Let's say it doesn't rain in those places. September, October, until the winter time. Let's say that the snows are late in coming and they don't amount to very much. I mean, you got to kind of play this by ear as we go along, but is there any precedent for this? What do you see coming down the pike here, weather-wise and climate and drought-wise?
Well, you may know that this is the third year in a row where there's a strong La Nina taking place in the Pacific, where the water is actually colder than normal off the coast of South America.
Mm.
That has happened before, but it's really unusual. So yeah, if it stays dry the rest of the year and through the winter, in much of Iowa, we will desperately need to have a wet spring, or I would think we're going to have serious problems next summer. But maybe the silver lining is, like I said, it's extremely rare to have 3 years of La Nina in a row. So hopefully that means that this La Nina will peter out. later this winter and the spring, and it will be more likely that we will have a more normal or wet summer next year. But with climate change, that's the thing that's sort of a mystery. Throw away the book that you've been using, the owner's manual. Maybe we'll have a fourth year of La Nina. So if you do hear this winter or spring that it looks like, okay, the experts predict the La Nina is going to last next year, I think there's going to be big problems in Iowa next summer with yields going way down.
Is there some self-promulgation with this? I wonder about it because it's really dry where I am. It seems like if a rain shower comes in, it just falls apart, just breaks away, just goes around us almost. Is it the same way with storms? I mean, does dry aridness on the land result in less rain, less storms, less derechos and that type of thing, or you can't really make that correlation?
There is a bit of a feedback, so it definitely plays a role. Normally on pretty big scales. So, like George, if your part of a county is really dry, that's probably going to not affect much because the moisture coming from the next county over can easily move over to where you are. But it likely is affecting certain types of storms that form. Maybe just some random thunderstorms become less likely if you're in an area that's become very dry. When you get a storm system like the one that produced the derecho, so something bigger is happening in the atmosphere, you will probably still get the rain from that, maybe not quite as much. And one thing you can point to, if you're really getting worried that your part of Iowa has been extremely dry, like, oh my goodness, it's never going to rain again. Think about the desert southwest of the U.S. this summer. They're getting floods all the time. Death Valley had their heaviest rain ever for one day. And it's certainly just as barren and rocky and sandy as it always is out there. So, I'd say the major part of our precipitation comes from what the jet stream is doing and what the big flow patterns are in the atmosphere. Having your soil get dry does make it harder to get the really heavy amounts, but it's usually pretty easy to get back to normal once the weather pattern just decides to switch back to something more normal.
Yeah. Folks, we've been talking with Dr. William A. Gallus, Jr. from Iowa State University about meteorology, weather forecasting, the climate, drought, derechos. I want to thank you again for coming on Podcast by George, as always, Doc. Anything in closing here that you want to give people a heads up on or keep an eye out for, or any of the research that you're doing, or anything you'd like to talk about here as we wrap up this edition of the Live Line?
I just think that two important points. One related to the drought is it unfortunately does look dry the next couple of weeks. So if you maybe not been watering a part of your lawn that was seeded just a year ago, and you're thinking, well, it's probably going to rain pretty soon, I would stop assuming that and maybe go out and water it. And the other relates, George, to something you said about derechos, which is, is climate change really changing something about derechos? And I just want to point out, there's been very little research done so far looking at that. So that is something that some of us at Iowa State are hoping to look into in the next couple of years.
Well, great. Good luck. Another term coming up, another year. You're back in the classroom now. No more remote. Are you still doing a hybrid? What's the situation there at the university?
At Iowa State, it will be normal, which I love the interactions with my students. So I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah, I'm very thankful for normal. Thanks again for coming on another podcast by George LiveLine.
Thanks, George.
And folks, if you like podcasts by George, if you like seeing Dr. William Gallus on the PBG Live Line, please subscribe to us at podcastbygeorge.com. You can go to Facebook or YouTube there, click on the icon, and you can follow us on Facebook. You can subscribe on YouTube. On YouTube, ring that notification bell. Make sure that you subscribe and give us a thumbs up. And then there's a half a dozen or so, maybe more, of audio-only podcast sites where you can get the audio versions of Podcast by George. And of course, everybody wants to go to Spotify and iTunes, but also Stitcher and Deezer and places like that. On iTunes, leave us another one of those 5-star reviews because that helps get us seen by or heard by more folks on iTunes. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.